Okay, I am back, and it is still April 6th, 2025. And this is another quick story on the fly. This is like a 3.3 version, okay? And what I wanted to point out and what I wanted to reiterate is that when I was growing up, I lived in a town called Elmhurst, and I lived on the north side of Elmhurst, which is in Illinois, and I was a couple miles away from O'Hare. I had a very big field where I grew up, huge power lines, a creek, and all that jazz, okay? And back in the days, the flight patterns for O'Hare were completely different. So I would be in my backyard as a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, and, I'd be kicking a soccer ball in the fall or when it's dark or wintertime, or I'd be on the sled hill, with friends in the wintertime, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you would just hear this massive plane coming in, and you would see the lights pop up, or you would hear landing gear, locking into place, or, all of a sudden it would be, a massive jumbo jet. And depending on the season and depending on the air and depending on the temperature, sound is completely different. So growing up, I always saw planes. You were always aware of what was in the sky. And sometimes you were even pausing or taking a break, so you could talk or stop talking or hear what somebody was saying because of the amount of sound, because of the amount of noise, because of, just how loud everything was. So oftentimes this would happen, and, you would just deal with it. And then there was a lot of other stuff growing up where, you'd see massive fires, and it was like, oh, this one plane, clipped an oil tanker in the field and blew up, and there was a massive explosion. And, my stepdad actually knew about it because he was running construction at the time. So even as a little kid, you're like, whoa, something happened at the airport, or, something's changed with the flight patterns. So moving forward, my stepdad, worked for McDonnell Douglas in the 70s, and later in life, we would sit up and watch TV shows sometimes about, old aerial combat and old airplanes and, things that were in the sky, and just, government shows and defense contractors and military and things like that. So that was part of it. Sorry, I got distracted by all the activity, let alone the people who were just parked next to me. Then, later in life, I lived in the city of Chicago, and I lived in a couple different places. One of the places I eventually lived on was the lakefront for about 8 years or so. And there's a tremendous amount of traffic that comes through and over the Chicago lakefront. They circle around sometimes before going into landing at O'Hare. Sometimes they're stacked up from all different directions, and you can see like a pyramid, literally, of planes or dots of light in the sky at night over the lake, because they're 3 in a row this way, 3 in a row that way, 3 in a row that way, and they're all converging onto like so many runways and patterns until they, continue on down like I-90 or whatever and approach the runways and the landing point. And there were many times I sat on the lakefront and watched all these planes at night, or as the clouds rolled in and a plane would pop up and a plane would disappear, or a plane would pop up and a plane would disappear, or there's a dot out here. And it was like a game. And you're like, whoa, there's just so much traffic out there, but you can't see it all at once. Or like I said, sometimes you can see 5 planes deep, all a mile apart, or whatever. So I know I'm babbling, and this is because of all the distractions here and all the people and people who can probably hear me with my windows partially down. But there were times I was sitting in my unit on the 12th floor, which overlooked the lakefront, and all of a sudden there'd be this bright light coming at me, and more bright light coming at me. And it would actually prompt me to get up out of my chair and look out the windows. And I had massive windows, that were they were the original windows that were put into this building like in the 60s or 70s, whenever the building was built. And since I was on the 12th floor, I could have these windows open even in the wintertime because of the way the heat rised in the building, and I'd be perfectly fine unless the wind was coming in that particular day. What I'm getting at is, I'm jumping all around here, is there were literally times I thought a plane was going to crash into my building, or I had the feeling or the memory or the knowing or the intention of like a UFO coming at me. It was that tripped out because the lights were so bright, or the planes seemed so low, or the progression of them coming at me seemed like it wasn't going to stop. And I mean, trust me, if you're watching TV and then you get distracted and then you actually have to get up out of your chair because you think something's coming at you, that's a little weird, right? That's a trigger. So living downtown, I took in all that air traffic as well for years, and then working throughout the city of Chicago. And the other thing about the lakefront is, I used to see when Obama would come into town, because Marine 1 and Marine 2 would always come up the lakefront from O'Hare, and they would always go, to his home in Hyde Park. You always knew that distinct sound of military choppers. You also knew the difference between the Coast Guard chopper that would make runs up and down the lakefront, throughout the day during, summer season. There's a lot of other little people in helicopters or things like that. So once again, you get very used to air traffic, you get used to patterns, and you get used to things, okay? So then bounce around again to moving out here where it's more country. Excuse me. And I have seen drones in the sky. I've seen hot air balloons, just as I've seen at other times in my life. I've seen paragliders. I have knowledge of about three different smaller airports out here, like in the Hills Airport, DuPage Airport when I lived in St. Charles off and on. There's another airport, I can't think of it right now, and then some of the different landing strips out here as well. So you see the little planes, you see people's Cessnas, little P-51s, you see biplanes and people doing tricks and having fun. You see private jets. You see, like I said, paragliders a little further out. You see the hot air balloons a little further out. Drones are more just for people screwing around and doing things like that. And then when you really get out to the farms, 10, 15 miles from here, you see actually crop dusters still. You see people zipping around and doing the fields, and you're like, wow, that still exists, or wow, that's still a niche. Or even just a couple miles from my home, there's this one piece of property. It's still used for a lot of farming, and then part of it's sitting, and they've got almost a quarter mile or a half mile field, and they got two planes with covers over them. So they got their own little landing strip, like I said, just like some of the other people do on some of the farms out here. Or there's the one little private landing strip where it's got, like, I think 8 or 10 hangars maybe, and each hangar's got 2 to 3 planes. I don't know. It's been a few years since I went over there. What I'm trying to get at is, over the years, living right outside O'Hare, living around O'Hare in the Chicagoland area, living on the lakefront, living out in the country, and even talking to someone who used to work and design things for planes and, the military and things like that, I have a pretty good understanding of air traffic. I have a pretty good understanding of, what's a hot air balloon, what's a drone, what's a plane, what's a paraglider, what's a jet, the sound, the exhaust, all of those things. So I thought I would throw that kind of out there as I put these stories out, because I know what I'm seeing. I know what I'm experiencing, and I know it doesn't make sense. So I guess that's everything in a nutshell. And I know I'm talking a little bit crazy, talking fast here, talking on the fly, talking unscripted, but I wanted to throw that little story in between, just to remind people that I've completely grown up all around air traffic. And as I've had past life regressions in the past, I have asked about some of these scenarios where these planes came over me and scared the shit out of me because of how, loud they were, but the amount of light that they were projecting. Or how there were times I literally stood up in my unit on the 12th floor and looked to the window like, what is happening? What's coming at me? That's kind of something I think that has been triggered or maybe buried, and might lead to other things or other revelations down the road. But I also know that it kind of relates to what I'm experiencing now. So I know this is a bit crazy. I know this is right off the top of my head. I know there's a lot of distractions here. People rolling in slow, people acting weird, people with their dogs, people with their family, people with whatever. But that's that story, and I think I'm just going to upload it because, like I said, this is all raw. So thanks for listening. I hope you are all well. Have a great day. Bye.